Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Today we're talking about Mayor of Kingstown, the Taylor Sheridan-produced series starring Jeremy Renner. It's streaming on Paramount Plus, and the finale of the third season is airing today. To talk about his work on this show, I'm happy to welcome back score composer Andrew Lockington. Andrew, nice to see you again.
Hey, great to see you too.
And co-hosting with me once again is composer and recording artist Louis Weeks. Louis, glad you could join us.
Hi, everybody.
Warning for listeners, today's conversation may contain spoilers for Mayor of Kingstown, but not for the season 3 finale, which, as I mentioned earlier, is airing today. I do think Paramount Plus releases shows early on Sunday. Possibly the finale is actually available now, but I haven't watched it yet. So, Andrew, I'm going to ask that you not spoil that episode.
No worries.
To kick us off, I'm going to play a little bit of the show's opening theme. So, Andrew, last year you joined us for an episode to talk about the first season of Special Ops Lioness, which was also a Taylor Sheridan show. And at the end, after the credits, I asked you about the Mayor of Kingstown theme. For listeners that might have missed that conversation, could you tell us again about the inspiration for this piece?
I do, as we talked about on Lioness, I do 3 series with Taylor. Mayor of Kingstown was the first, our first time we met, the first time we started working together. And at the very beginning, he had me read all the scripts for Mayor of Kingstown. I knew the entire season. They hadn't started filming, and he said, "Just start writing ideas. See what inspires you from the writing, and just go from there." So, in thinking that this is this broader piece, almost a commentary or an editorial on the American prison system as a whole, I remembered being a kid and flipping through the TV and seeing a scene from the film Cool Hand Luke, Paul Newman, very famous film before my time. I don't think I actually watched the whole film, but I remember seeing this scene where you've got sort of this chain gang on the highway. They're all doing road work, all prisoners in their prison uniform. And what I remember being struck by when seeing it was the rhythm of their movements were all synchronized and just naturally, not any intention. I'm sure it wasn't the intention of Frank Pearson when he wrote the script or the director. I don't know if that was Frank as well, but it was this. I remembered this image of these prisoners all synchronized working on the side of the road, and the monotony of it and the very slow pace and gait to it. I guess in my mind, I was scoring that image in that perspective. So the very first piece of music I wrote was what ended up being the theme for Mayor of Kingstown. And Taylor heard it. He'd heard one piece of music and he said, "Yeah, that's the theme. That's it." And it never really changed. I mean, it was a few little tweaks, but that very first inspiration ended up being sort of the root of the score and the template for how we would approach all the music in the series.
I want to follow up on something you said. You talked about reading all of the scripts. And I'm reminded that from the last time, working with Taylor Sheridan is, well, I won't say unique since you guys carry it from show to show, but it's different than maybe a lot of score composition takes place. Could you sort of summarize this for again about what is your working relationship?
Yeah, Taylor is incredible with music. He's amazing. He has very smart ideas. He's amazing at coming up with ideas and commenting and directing music. And it's also a very integral part of the entire production to him, not just post-production, but it's an element that he wants to have in his head as he's shooting. He'll sometimes sit on set and play things I've written for him on his phone while they're playing back a scene or while they're shooting a scene. We basically started out, and prior to them shooting anything, I just started writing music. I had ideas for themes. I had ideas for how characters would work, and he and I talked at length about some of the overlap where, for example, a theme like Leave Someday in the show is about one day we're going to get out of here and there's a future for us that is a utopian future. and how so many of the characters can share that. That's not married to one character, it's something everyone can share. So basically, I write a bunch of music and they only edit with the music I've written for the show. The typical process for TV and film, an editor and a director will put together a rough cut before the composer has started with what we call temp music, temporary music from other films, other soundtracks. And it's meant to sort of give a style and some direction to the composer of the rough vibe they're looking for. But Taylor's process, at least with me, and I'm sure in some respect on his other shows as well, with other composers, is I write a bunch of music and they only edit with that. And I work very closely with Taylor and the picture editors. And when they don't have something in the music I've created, the little library, so to speak, then I start writing specific things to specific scenes. And the music really evolves from there. And actually, even more than that, I'll often write something and Taylor will say, oh, I really, like, I'll give you an example. We're doing a series called Landman that comes out in the fall. I wrote a cue and he said, oh, this is really cool with the synth, but what's the acoustic version of that? What is this just on acoustic guitar, an acoustic bass, an acoustic drum kit? So there's a lot of exploration in that way. The music is really coming together parallel to the production side and the shows being edited and even shot.
I'm really curious about what you said about the moments where you have to write to picture, because it's a pretty, rare relationship to have the music written beforehand and edited exclusively with your music to the picture. I know a lot of composers are almost always writing to picture and having to contend with the expectation of what the temp score had created versus what they will do now when they've seen the picture. In your case, when something from your library of music that you've written from the scripts isn't working for a scene and you have to write to picture, what tends to be the thing that you really need to look at to see in order to score? What's the kind of thing that maybe you couldn't have anticipated from looking at the score?
Yeah. So first off, just to elaborate on saying, the writing to picture, what ends up happening is they end up temping using my sketches, which is usually a 2 to 4 minute piece of music. It's not hitting the moments when they use it. It's giving it's kind of doing what other temp music does. It's giving the vibe. The one thing beyond that is it's usually thematically appropriate. So they're using it thematically in such a way that it works with the character. There's some continuity with that character and its evolution in the story as a whole. But when I get the picture and they've temped it in, it very much is always writing each of those cues to picture in the same sort of typical way that we've always worked. But when it doesn't work, it's a good question. I think the incredible thing about Taylor, when he writes a script and then you see it after it's been shot, you almost feel like, oh, I've seen this one, because the image you had in your head when you read the script is so precisely what he executes that there are so many similarities. Where that can sometimes differ is if, in the case of Mayor Jeremy, Mike McCluskey, Jeremy Renner's character, he doesn't wear his heart on his sleeve. He is very, very withdrawn. He is a massive defense mechanism. He is not outwardly affectionate. And I realize as an actor, he is very measured in how much of that he will allow to get through. And so the music you have to really walk a tightrope, because you can really screw up a scene if the music is much less guarded than his character, or vice versa, if it's much more restrained than he's being. So when it comes to course correction, that's probably the biggest thing is when an actor has been very restrained, had a lot of restraint in the way they've done a scene, and you want to make sure that the music doesn't go too far. Now, just to elaborate on that, I did a film years ago with Donald Sutherland, who very sadly recently passed. And he was both the director, producer, writer. And so I worked very closely with him in post. And I was able, in addition to accumulating a wealth of incredible stories of Hollywood before my time and sort of his collaborations and his experiences with these legends in our industry, we were able to talk, like I was actually able to say, how do you feel as an actor when you do a scene and you've walked a tightrope and then the music comes in and it's very emotive and it sort of throws off the balance of your performance? And his answer really surprised me. He responded that he's done it for so long that he can anticipate how the music will change the balance of a scene. So he will actually course correct himself. And sometimes he'll hold back a little bit. So it gives somewhere for the music to sort of infer a certain emotional movement behind the wall he creates. So that was the first time I've ever actually met an actor who was able to tell me that they think about what I do. You, as a composer, as you know, Louis, you sort of feel like you're the sprinkles on the icing on the cake after the cake's been baked and all the ingredients have long since gone home. But it was really nice to know that that you're a more important ingredient that everyone else is taking into consideration.
I think that's a really profound insight from an actor, because it is such an inside baseball, like composer's insight, where, I once had a mentor tell me that their approach to animation was you score all the action, and their approach to live action was you score the eye movements to kind of infer a kind of interiority. And I think that, like, what I find fascinating about Mayor of Kingstown is like the thriller component of it, the action component of it is often like I don't see you scoring a lot of the big action moments in a way that I think a lot of people assume movie music works.
Mm.
I see a lot of the music driving that interiority. To me, it makes sense that is coming through from the script level, right? And someone like Jeremy Renner, who's really playing it really, really low, and muted. So it's interesting to me to hear that those are the moments that you have to go in and kind of be surgical about. Would expect nothing less from Donald Sutherland, but it is a fascinating insight from an actor.
Yeah, and it's also a reminder that as a composer, and all of us in post, I've had these same conversations with my sound post people as well, is you don't want to reiterate what's on screen. You want to, as often as possible, tell a different side of the story or give context to their performance. Give something for them to be acting against. If it was a comedy, sometimes you're the straight man, and they're being aloof. And if it's a comedy and they're being straight, sometimes the music's wacky, and that, is the role. So I think the funny thing with Mare is I remember when we first started out and we were coming up with the whole tone in the world, and Taylor said, we need to have 5 to 10% good. Like the music has to have this element where we can just say to everyone, hey, here's a moment you can take a breath and not feel the weight on, this incredible oppression of this world. And I remember after we did that, we took a look back in sort of the 30,000 foot view and realized, oh shit, we've just actually made the dark stuff feel that much darker because we've told everyone how bright the sun is outside the prison and outside Kingstown, how beautiful the world is. So now it just makes it feel that much worse. And it was funny that it had the opposite reaction, that you can put these, Iris's theme, for example, is this sort of lullaby. I tried to write something, what would her mother have hummed to her to make her go to sleep when she was a little girl? And that is as far away from her reality now. And it's interesting how you can sometimes do the opposite, and it can be even more powerful. And I think the action scenes you mentioned, we try to do that too. If they're running in a scene, then the music going da 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 is just reiterating what their energy. But if the music is actually giving context to the emotional, the stakes of what's happening, instead of just, maybe they're not thinking about those stakes. They're acting this very kinetic moment where they're running or they're fighting, but the music can sometimes tell you what those stakes are, and it doesn't have to be kinetic in the way the imagery is.
Andrew, when you talked about themes for characters, we talked about some of that before. You referenced a piece earlier, Leave Someday. Here, I'll play a longer selection from that. When you're writing for, as you described it, almost a state of mind that can be shared by multiple characters, is there a different approach on how you do that, or even this specific piece, how it came together?
Yeah, this piece, it was actually something I was trying to come up with ideas. What I'll sometimes do is I'll spend 80% of my day writing very specifically to the show, and then I'll just do 20% of my day will be a brain dump where I'm just trying to channel the gods and just write something without worrying about what the context is or how it'll work or if it's right or if it works. It's just a very, it's like an artist just closing their eyes, I guess, and painting whatever happens. And Leave Someday was very much that. It was just trying to write something. I guess what came out of me was something about hope and this idea that there's a utopian future. And I think so much of the world and so many characters are always saying, well, if we get through our rough day Thursday, then Friday's going to be great. If I get through Friday, but it's the finish line just keeps getting further and further and further away. And you never get that release of complete relaxation and complete reward for getting through the gauntlet. So when I think about themes, my favorite themes are not the Peter and the wolf. It's not, oh, here's Peter, here's this instrument, here's the wolf, here's this instrument. My favorite themes are actually things that you can use to bind characters that aren't always on screen together. They might not share screen time, they might not have a scene together, but you can use the music to demonstrate that they actually are facing the same struggle and going through a very similar situation.
I'm curious, on a multi-season project, what is the calculus now on season 3 of, okay, the music for this season has to be X percentage like what we've heard before and X percentage new? What are those conversations like, and how did that bear out musically and in the work?
Yeah, so very similar to the other seasons, I set out and started writing and recording things before we shot, and started getting it to the editors and the showrunners and Taylor. Hugh Dillon, who plays Ian in the show, is also one of the creators. He created the series with Taylor, and he and I worked closely in the off season. One of the cool things about Hugh is there's a band called the Headstones rock band. He's actually a bona fide rock star. Like, he's a singer, songwriter. If he was not an actor, he would be an incredibly successful touring musician, recording artist, like he is. He somehow is living this double life. But being able to play stuff for him, and I remember very distinctly, I was throwing him these, things that were loosely based on some of the themes we had in seasons 1 and 2, but were more industrial and, using feedback as an instrument instead of just as an effect. And I said, Hugh, I think I might have gone too far. And he's like, no, this is great. We need this. Everybody's unraveling. So everybody is going to share this kind of approach. So that ended up being it's not a theme because it's not a melody or a rhythm or a motif, but it was sort of an evolution of all of the themes into that direction of this very dirty, gritty world, and going even further than we'd gone before.
What I think is really effective about a lot of the music in the show is the way that you use drones, very long, sustained, unrelenting idea, kind of places us emotionally where the characters are. I'm wondering, to what extent is that a conscious choice, or is that kind of like this is kind of the language of writing to picture in some regards, I guess my question is, to what extent are you juggling, balancing the idioms of what you do as a writer for film and television versus, okay, let's kind of create the wheel from nothing and based on just what the script has for us?
This is where the editors really come in a big way, because they'll go through the stuff I've done in the past and they'll say, we love this drone. It's funny. It is a drone. I kind of think of it more like a cloud, because a lot of these drones are things that I've played, put through a 30-second delay, done some looping, dropped it an octave, and so it's sustained, but it's evolving within that suspension. And it's often it has these very long moments where it then restarts the structure and starts over again. So and a lot of that stuff, what I love about the post on this show is a lot of that stuff ends up getting used almost in a room tone kind of way, that we're really blurring the line between sound design and music. It's almost like a filter or color timing that a cinematographer would do. The music is really putting this very specific dark shade of blue-gray over this whole series and this world. And it's funny because in experimenting with season 3, it was very obvious when I stepped off that path, and you suddenly go, oh wow, Kingstown's fine now. It's not dangerous anymore. And it's like, oh shit, okay, that was a mistake. We've got to go back to that sound. So there are definitely parameters, and there's definitely a through line of the show that the music is very much an identity element of how the show and the world is perceived. But trying to expand on those boundaries and sometimes purposefully go out of the way so that you can journey back again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I also feel like there's a distinction between soundscapes, something that feels like it's environmental, like you said, juxtaposed with things that are discrete musical notes, like things that are like, oh, that feels like a keyboard part. What's the process behind that kind of decision making?
I had this Hot Wheels set as a kid that you would build a track and you would have a loop to loop, and you'd have these little die-cast metal cars that would go around this loop. And we had this thing that you'd wind up, and it would basically you would wind it up so that the car could get through the loop to loop, get around the track, and just barely make it back to this accelerator, these wheels that would then slingshot the car and go around again. And I think scoring is very much like that. You have to make sure that you are propelling the story. You can go so long with the room tone idea before you need to inject a little bit of adrenaline into what's going on. And someone once, another analogy, someone once said, I've never driven, by the way, a Ferrari or a McLaren or a really nice car, but they said, when you're going 200 miles an hour in those cars, you don't feel it. You feel the same as if you're sitting still. And it's the speeding up and slowing down and the shifting gears that you feel the effect of a really valuable, fast, expensive sports car. So I think scoring is like that too. You can feel the entrances, the exits, you feel it speeding up, you feel it slowing down. It's the changes that can have the biggest dramatic effect on a scene.
I think we're dating ourselves that I know exactly what you're talking about as well with those little diecast cars and the tracks you're talking about. Andrew, let's talk about some specific themes. Talk to me about Orion. Here, let me play a bit of it.
So Orion, it's named after the scene in, I think it was, I don't remember if it was episode 2 or 4 in season 1, where Bunny and Mike McCluskey are sitting down and having a beer and a chat and looking at the stars. And it's one of those good moments. It's not Leave Someday in the sort of purity sense, but it's this moment where you can relate to these guys. And what I love about this show, and it's been a challenge musically, is we always, as an audience, we always enjoy something much more if we can put ourselves in the place of a character. When you're just watching or reading a story and you're in the third person and you're observing, it's very different than imagining you're them. You're the superhero. You're in the army storming the beach of Normandy. You want to put yourself in that place. And with a show like this, what I love about Taylor's writing is he makes you see the human qualities in these people that you would otherwise write off in life and say, I have nothing in common with this person. They've done despicable things. I can't relate to them in any way. And here you have Bunny, who's the leader of this gang. He's ordered hits. He's personally killed people. And he's sitting down talking about when he was a kid and he'd get fried chicken and his grandma would make something and look at the stars and laughing. And I think that's one of the secret ingredients to this show, is that you can actually relate to these characters. You can't relate to the things they've done. You can't relate to a lot of who they are, but there's a little person in them that you either were as a kid or that you knew someone like that. And so Orion, I mean, it's a great example of that. And it's really funny how so often you can have themes I've done this so many times in scores where you have a really dark theme that you then later show the light side of and you evolve to good, because usually films are evolving to a good place. And Bunny, through the 3 seasons, is actually getting darker and darker and more dangerous. So to actually take this thematic material and this motif and make it darker and darker instead of the opposite, I really like that idea and that evolution. And again, this is one of the amazing things about series these days, is that they're really written like 10-hour movies. They're not, single episodes encapsulated and they begin and they end, and then episode 2 is a whole different story and a whole different thing. So musically you can approach it like a film and say, wow, this is great, I have this theme, I'm going to write it this way, and I know that over the course of the next 7 or 8 episodes I can plan out this evolution. So there's this continuity musically that I think couldn't exist in the past model of television or series, just by the fact that they were never written. So you were, as a composer, you were writing something in episode 2, but you had no idea if that character was going to survive through episode 5, because even the writers hadn't decided yet. So in terms of the themes, as we talk about them, that's one of the things I really like. And another example is we had this prophecy theme that we would use to score Miriam in the prison when she would tell stories in season 1 and 2. It's sort of this idea that Taylor had written into the script these stories that were about the downfall of all these civilizations. And that was what she was teaching. And it always struck me that that theme would one day apply to her family and her sons, her boys. And so even though, spoiler alert, Miriam has passed, the first episode of season 3, we find that out. This theme remains because it's almost the curse that sits over the family, and they feel like she predicted the downfall. She predicted all these terrible things would happen. And every time we hear that theme, we're drawn back to that, knowing there's this prophecy that the family could end up exactly like all the other stories she's told.
In both these cases, Andrew, I'm curious about how these themes evolve. Specifically on the Orion, you mentioned those scenes from the early episodes of the first season. That relationship between McCleskey and Bunny is really a core thread. Do the themes evolve from season to season and you're revisiting, or are you creating new themes that are inspired by these early works to present them again?
Yeah, no, both. I mean, the melodies are the root, and the root of the idea is the same, and the way that it's evolved and the way I present it evolves and is different as we get later. But you bring up a good example, because there's a moment, I can't remember which episode it is, but I think we would have seen it already, where Constantine explains to Iris the origin of her name, where that name came from. And it's an opportunity to go back even earlier than the version of the theme that we hear the first time, the one I was talking about, which kind of sounds like like a lullaby that her mother would have played for her as a little girl. So that's sort of how, this theme is evolving as Iris is evolving. And then we have this story where musically we can go back to a very simple early version of that. And I don't fool myself into thinking that the audience is going, oh, wow, this is an early version of the Iris theme. But the whole point of it and the hope is that this is adding to the overall experience of the visuals, the sound, the music, and how they're telling the story. And if you can make the audience feel a certain way and come to a certain emotion on their own, then I think you're going a long way towards contributing to the storytelling.
I have this theme titled Having a Baby. Listeners, here's the piece we're talking about. Tell us where this is used and your inspiration for it.
So the origin of that theme was season 1. Kyle has had a horrific day, and he comes home and he finds out that they are pregnant, having a baby. And it's this, he has to sort of let everything go, all this trauma that he's just gone through, and be happy about something. And it's, again, I guess it's another version of this sort of pure good. But that theme in and of itself, I mean, I think of it as Kyle being, I'm in the shit right now, but I really hope that my baby will grow up and not be in that. And an example of what we're talking about with themes, I use this theme for Mike. When he's talking about Kyle's his little brother. He doesn't want Kyle to have to go through any of this stuff. He's the one that if he can get Kyle out of Kingstown and Kyle's okay, then he knows he's done some good, even if he's doomed to never leave. Same with Iris. Constantine, I think, has this weakness for Iris where he thinks, I've done all these horrific things, but if Iris can be okay, if she can escape Kingstown unharmed and have a whole fresh new life, then I've done some good. Something good has come of all of this horrible stuff. So that's something that gets revisited a lot, and I sort of hide it in different instrumentations and use it in different ways, but it's again sort of, as a parent, you tend to realize that sometimes it's okay if you're not okay, as long as your kid is okay, as long as someone gets out. It's being in the mud pit and the quicksand and pushing someone to safety to your own detriment.
That theme is really a good example that we were talking about earlier of kind of the power of discrete musical notes as opposed to a kind of wash of ambient. To me, one of the things about the show is the kind of juxtaposition emotionally between kind of chaos and clarity,
Mm-hmm.
where there's a kind of adrenaline fueled, like you can only kind of hear the ringing in your ears and the kind of like the you can hear your kind of blood rushing. And then there's a theme like having a baby, which has just such musical clarity to it. That works really well to me because I think that there's a lot of ambiguity in that. And it leaves, like you were talking about earlier, space for an actor's performance to play it kind of how they want to play it. But I'm wondering if that's a kind of like calculation that you and Taylor have when you talk about these themes, or if that's just emergent from, this is the clear and obvious thing that happens when you are reading these scripts.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I remember very specifically with that theme, Taylor and I talked about how we're going to write the music to be how he should feel. This is how this should be his reaction. This should be the only thing he thinks about. And then the actor himself, Taylor Handley, can stray from that, but the music is scoring how he thinks he's supposed to feel. It's really interesting. It's kind of a way of, I often feel if the music is just reiterating what the actor did, then you are in one dimension. If anything, you're over exaggerating what an actor took great care to do very specifically and to the right degree. The one interesting thing, and this is a longer story, but basically when we filmed season one idea I'd written all these different themes and rhythms and drum parts, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to go into the prison where they were filming, the decommissioned penitentiary, and actually use this real reverb, and so we did that before they even filmed any of those scenes. Before they started filming for day one on season one, I went into prison during COVID with a bunch of musicians and started recording. And the plan was to do multiple sessions playing exactly these rhythms I had, and got in there. And I think it was in the morning of the first session, somebody, I don't know if it was me or one of the percussionists, somebody leaned over and in the middle of a take, took the mallet and hit the gate, hit the prison bars. And suddenly it's like, whoa, that's cool. And then the whole experience went from hitting these instruments that we were playing to actually playing the prison, slamming doors, stomping boots on the landings, using soft mallets and playing the cages. Like it turned into this incredible sound library of rhythms and sounds that we could use. Now, when I did research into the prison, it came to my attention. Season one was filmed in Canada, and this prison had the infamy of being where the deadliest prison riot had ever taken place. And the reason this prison riot took place was there was a bell in the middle of this prison, the old stone prison built in the 1800s, that would be rung for every event. It would be rung for breakfast. It would be rung for wake up. It was rung for going outside. It was yard time. And the sound of the reverb in this prison was so obnoxious and so offensive. And it would just, your shackles would go up on your neck every time a loud noise happened. And it would keep settling on the same kind of pitch, no matter what sound you made, whether you clapped or you yelled or you hit a drum or you slammed a door. The tail of that reverb, it morphed into the same thing every time. And the prisoners said that their reason for rioting was to destroy the bell. That was the whole uprising, was that this bell sound was so obnoxious and so offensive to them. They had to get into the little guard booth through the bulletproof glass and destroy it. And they were successful. That was what they did. So this experience and then hearing this story, Taylor and I thought, Mike's been in prison. Jeremy Renner's character was in prison. He's now out, but he never can escape that. So wouldn't it be cool if that reverb of that prison that he's lived with, that everything sounds like that, got applied to the whole score? If that is something that every cue echoes the way his whole life experience, his whole internal thoughts, every soliloquy that he gives is bathed in this reverberation that defined his life. So that cue, Leave Someday, was actually that theme. That was the first time that we took that reverb and we applied it to something good and beautiful and said, we're going to bathe this in the complexity of the echo of this darkness, even though it's major chords and it's a happy melody, we're going to give it that same oppression on the reverberation.
It's fascinating. Very cool.
This theme, Stabbing, here, let me play some of it.
Yeah, so there was a scene at the end of season 1 where we had this almost industrial sound that I couldn't recreate it because I was just messing around with all my pedals and weird sounds and came up with this. And actually, I have an amazing sound designer, Michael White, who also helped me create a lot of these sounds for the show. But it's the lead up to the stabbing of the prison guard. And well, it was initially intended just for that scene. Some of the editors came up with the idea of every time we have a death coming, when there's a hit about to go down, when somebody, you know, they're about to get offed, having this ominous kind of Grim Reapers suddenly in the shadows in the back coming towards us sound with the music. And it's ended up being very, a really cool sort of precursor to a lot of the darkness and death that happens in the show. The fun thing when you establish a rule like that and you do it a lot of the time is it gives you the opportunity to break that rule. So you can have it kind of come up, and I think people will subconsciously expect something really bad to happen and it doesn't happen. And then you can also make something really bad happen and you didn't give them any warning, that you didn't hear the Grim Reaper coming like you have other times. So, but it's something that's been a big part of season 3. I know our audience hasn't seen episode 10 of season 3 yet, but my God, it's epic. It's incredible. It's it could be a movie in and of itself. Skid, I know we were talking a little bit about themes. There's another theme called Bear.
I'm going to insert a selection of that piece here.
So the beginning of season 1, Mitch, the older brother, what a great character. Kyle Chandling, love him as a actor. And I had written a theme for him, and actually, longer backstory, I had written a bunch of themes, and this actually will kind of be an interesting conversation about music, because I can't put my finger on this, how this works. But I had written 4 or 5 things for Taylor, and I sent him a batch of 4 or 5. And in and amongst those was Bear, which I had written upon hearing of a childhood friend who'd passed away. I heard about it and was shaken, and I sat down at the piano and wrote this very simple single piano note melody, very rubato, very spread out. Almost the space between the notes is as important as the notes themselves. And I actually would have thought that anybody in the world who heard all 5 would have had the same reaction to all 5, because technically they were all very similar. They were just five different theme ideas. And Taylor called me up and said, "Whoa, this bear thing, what's that? How did you write that? What happened there?" And to this day, it's reminded me that in music, there is this intangible element that you can't see in the sound waves. You can't mathematically explain what it is, but there is something that somehow gets through on the carrier waves while being invisible, but is sensed from the human on the other side. And I can't figure out what that is and how that works. And those are always the holy grails to me. They're the little gold nuggets that you're looking for in our job, are the coming up with these things that people will have that response to. And it amazes me that you can be in a certain frame of mind and write something, and someone on the other side can pick up on that 100%. So, Bear in and of itself as a theme, it was written for Mitch when Mitch died, and how Mike McCluskey feels about his older brother dying and just being devastated. But he goes from there, and there's a bear in the latter half of the season who I said to Taylor, the bear really kind of feels like Mitch to me. He's the same thing. He's this older sort of lug who, can't help himself but do barbaric things sometimes, and, maybe should be put down, but actually he wants to look after him and look out for him, and he's fond of him. And that theme transitioned to that. And since season one has transitioned to, Mike doesn't love babies, but I think he feels a responsibility to look out for Kyle's kid and Kyle. And so it ended up being an important theme that outlived the character, much like prophecy has outlived Miriam. They're still there, present in the music somehow.
I think that's a really beautiful story about, the composing of that piece. It makes me often think about how what's tricky about writing for programmatic music, writing for story or like picture, is that the expectation is that every note is a one-to-one mapping of some other meaning. But music really kind of defies that that rule. It seems to me that like it's not the vessel that gets you to a meaning. Oftentimes it is just the meaning itself. There's something very abstract and very kind of intangible about it, even when you're making music for picture, right? Even when you're making music that is supposed to have a story behind it, there are often these moments like you're describing where like the thing about it that crackles is like it's not a literal depiction of something, or it's not even representative of something, but it just has that buzz to it. And this actually kind of segues into what I wanted to talk with you about process, because I think one of the things that sounds to me like Taylor was reacting to was your interpretation, your performance. A lot of people, when they think about composers, or they think about like film composers, I think they have a very old idea that like it's pen and paper, and it's you then outsource all of the performances to other players. But the reality is that it's so much more of a hybrid, blurred lines position between a performer and a composer. And I'm wondering how performance yourself plays into your scores versus the kind of traditional notation handed off to another player. Or even just kind of like, how does improvisation versus kind of planned composition play into your process?
That's a great question. There are two distinct paths in Mare, and the orchestral element, which we record with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra in London at Abbey Road, just to plug them because they're amazing, and Abbey Road is obviously amazing, is very much the notated part that they then they perform as musicians and take to a whole other level, which is their gift. I think it's you'll notice in the score that element recurs constantly. You have this string element that's constantly coming back that feels more more like a typical scoring. In terms of every other element, it's almost all stuff that I'm doing, or Michael White, my amazing sound designer, has come up with, drone sounds or synth weirdness. And I'll often sit and the day I write something, I'll record it on that instrument, because there's something about that moment that I'm feeling it, that the recording of it is the most honest. You know, I say this to songwriters as well. Like, the day you feel it, the day you feel that song, record the lyrics to it, because you will, every other time you will be telling a story, but today you are feeling, that's how you feel. That's the most literal interpretation. And a lot of times I feel both musical performances and singing a song, it's like a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and it loses its uniqueness and all the little magical things, parts of it that might have been technically wrong, but because they came from an emotional place, they're much more important. You know, one example is the humming on the theme of Mare. That's me. That's like 7 of me humming that. And that was the day I wrote it. And I went back multiple times. I brought in other singers to try to hum it, and we never captured what that somehow captured in the day I came up with it. And so so much of the other elements and the clouds that we were talking about, the drone-like elements, are recorded the day I come up with it.
You know, to bring it full circle, to me, that feels a lot like what Donald Sutherland is talking about, where he is giving a performance. And when you're performing on screen, you're leaving a lot of space for the other performers to do their thing. But it sounds like he's also has an innate understanding that the composer is a performer too, right? And that there's like got to be space for that performer as well. So it sounds like when people listen to Mayor of Kingstown, they're really, really engaging with you specifically and listening to your personal performance and your personal interpretation of the music, which is a really intimate thing. And I think it works really well because it's such an intimate story, you know?
Yeah, I think you're also capturing a moment. I mean, you love it or hate it. I have a lot of outboard gear. I'm as you know, because we'll tell the listeners that I could not figure out the sound or the miking and how the Zoom audio part of it works, which we all kind of had a laugh about at the beginning of this interview. But
laughing with you, not at you.
Exactly. I felt that. I have all this gear that I don't totally understand, and I haven't read all the details about, but I'll just play and experiment, and I'll come up with these sounds, or we called them kind of these clouds, and I could never ever recreate that. And by the way, even if I wrote down all the knob settings, there are so many tiny variations that are the butterfly flapping its wings that changes the future, that you could never recreate it. So when I happen on something I really like, I'll record for 25 or 30 minutes as many variations as I can think of, and in as many different ways as I can, because I know I'm never going to get it back. And those become the things I use to sort of build the score and these soundscapes. And while sometimes I'm so depressed because I wish I'd done this, I can't get that back, there's something I love about the idea that this only happens once. This only occurred once, and you're never going to get this moment back. And that's what makes it special. And over time, I mean, in some of the motifs in Mare, in the score, I've made a mistake. I played the wrong note, or I touched a note on the piano through the timeline, and you heard it just for a second, but the overtones of that hammer almost hitting the string is actually amazing. Whereas if I'd had time to edit myself, and if that was something I was recording at Abbey Road with the piano player, they wouldn't be able to recreate that. So I think you're right. I hope that that's why scores are getting more and more interesting, and I hadn't really thought of that. So I'm glad you brought it up about the performance aspect, that you're you're capturing the composer's very literal and direct idea because they're playing it.
It's tricky though, right? Because, and I'll just, tell the listeners that a huge part of making music for media revolves around the edits process. And there's so much iteration and there's so much notes and feedback that's given and so much fine tuning that, like, to me, when I hear you say that your process has a lot of kind of moments of zen where there's like a lot of imperfections that kind of influence, or there's just a capturing of a moment that can never be captured again, and the settings aren't recorded. And to me, when I hear you say that, what I'm hearing you say is that Taylor also shares in that zen approach with you, because I don't see how it would work if that's not a approach that's adopted by the whole team. Is that the case?
I think so. I think the other thing in my favor is that they're hearing the performance, they're hearing the recorded end process. So as it gets temped in, they fall in love with all the little scars and blemishes that I've fallen in love with. It's funny. I was doing another project recently, and I wrote something and sent a string mock-up to the director, and he said, I could respond better to this if it was the real orchestra, if you could kind of put it in the real orchestra, because I can't really hear through MIDI. And I said to my wife, wow, I can't believe, we're at the point where directors expect to hear ideas and mock-ups with a real orchestra, which I think is actually what happened 50 years ago. But we're so far from that now. And she said, well, wait a minute, isn't that what you do with Taylor? And I realized, oh shit, yeah, I do. Like I have the freedom to come up with these ideas and go and record them and present them to him as a performance, even with the orchestra. And I think because of that, it's a huge luxury, number one, but we also, you don't get the notes that you would get if it was a MIDI thing where it's an approximation of what it will sound like. It's a performance, like you were saying earlier.
It's really cool. It takes a lot of like creative courage, frankly, to embark on that process, I think.
Well, it has taught me a lot, and it's definitely changed the way I work with other filmmakers and showrunners. But the biggest thing, which I wish I'd known younger, is get out of your way. Get out of your own way. Don't self-edit in the same way that I do. And to be honest, Chad Galster, who I know has been on the show before, he is one of Taylor's main editors. And he's helped me a ton, because he'll often say to me, send me the stuff that you didn't want to send because you were insecure about it. And I'll send it to him. And he just said to me the other night, he said, when you send that stuff, that's my challenge. I want to see if I can use that stuff, because you don't know, you haven't come up with an explanation of how it works or how it's appropriate, but I might hear it and go, yeah, it should be this, or it should be that. So, and it's reminded me just in my writing to not always set out with very fine parameters, because even when I work with other musicians, a lot of times I try to be as loose as possible, because I don't want them to edit themselves to the point that all the magic's gone. So I try to have an open mind with what I'm writing. And if I try to decide after I've come up with an idea whether it's appropriate or not, but let the creativity just be abstract and free flow and see what happens.
So, Andrew, you teased us a pretty monumentous final episode to season 3. As we said, we're not going to do spoilers on that, but can you tease us anything about the future of this series?
I have not been looped in on that as of yet, and what I have been looped in on would actually violate our spoiler alert, and may violate my contractual obligations in some way that I'm unaware of. So I will choose the fifth on that one. But I can say that if you wake up early to watch episode 10 of season 3, you will not be disappointed. It's such an epic episode, and it's quite amazing.
I'm looking forward to that. On that note, we'll call it a wrap. And you know what? I think we're going to go out on the theme music. Great having you guys both here.
Thanks, guys. It's always nice to talk to you, and I apologize if I'm too verbose, and I will count on you to edit me down if I say too much. But I love talking about this stuff, and I really appreciate that you have an interest in it.
Oh, we loved it. Thank you.
Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. I didn't think it ran too long, but did you think it ran too long? Let us know. You'll find my contact info at our website, belowtheline1word.biz. That's B-I-Z. You'll also find past episodes and links to all of our social media, so check it out. Andrew, you teased Landman earlier. Tell us a little bit more about that and any other projects you have in the queue.
Yeah, Landman comes, I believe it's November 17th this fall, and it's very different than anything Taylor and I have done, and it was very fun to explore a completely different musical world with him. And also coming up later this year, I think, is season 2 of Lioness, which is filming as we speak.
And which you could not tell us was going to happen when we talked to you last year, but I'm glad to see it came together. Looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think there's a lot of very exciting things in the Taylorverse coming our way. So fans of Taylor Sheridan have a lot to look forward to.
Closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and to all of our listeners, I appreciate you. The Below the Line logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line. So, Andrew, I've held you a while longer. I've put off going to watch the finale myself because I did want to ask a couple of questions about episode 9 that are actually spoilers for folks. So if you haven't caught up on season 3, pause here. First of all, on the softer side, there's a scene in episode 9 where Raphael, who's played by rapper D Smoke, he's playing the piano with his son. And his son asks him about a bit of music on the piano, and he says, something I made up, something of my own. I'm curious whether D Smoke indeed wrote that music, and therefore it's sort of a needle drop, or if there's some sort of collaboration on the score side when the script calls for something like that.
So in this particular case, there was no collaboration. I'm a huge fan and not a contributor to Raphael's song in that piece. My understanding is it's something of his that he made up and played in the moment. I love it because, again, what we were talking about earlier, it's this idea that there's an element that we can all relate to. This guy who's in this impossible life that you have nothing in common with, being a leader of a gang in prison, actually also took piano lessons as a kid, also sat against the piano while his presumably his family was making a meal and he was doing his lesson practice. So I think that's such an intelligent element to the character, and we're really lucky that D Smoke is the actor who's playing Raphael, because that makes it a very authentic experience when he does that.
Now, if it wasn't a musician, in other words, it was an actor just cast in that role and it called for a scene like that, is that something that score would have gotten involved in, or again, would it have been sourced elsewhere?
I did a film called The Kindness of Strangers, and Bill Nighy was the actor. And there was a scene in the film where Bill Nighy sat down at the piano and played a piece. And the director and I decided after they had filmed, wouldn't it be cool if that was actually a piece from the score? I love it when a score theme can actually be played by some of the characters. So that was a moment where the piece itself, instead of teaching Bill how to play it, which I would have tried to do had we thought of the idea earlier, but I had to actually write the piece to match his body movements and the gait of everything he was doing and his swaying, which was actually really fun to do. And he thanked me at the premiere in Berlin and said how he appreciated that he could add that to his resume now that he could play piano.
Well, I have one final question before I let you off the hook, and this is a legitimate spoiler for folks who haven't seen the penultimate episode. And that is, in the final scene, our Russian mob lieutenant is pulling into the shipping docks. This scene builds and builds until Milo returns, and then just the score just goes through the roof. And I'm curious about this piece and sort of your approach to it and what you're delivering here.
Yeah, so this is also based on the Grim Reaper. idea. We played around with the idea of having Milo's theme, but again, my disdain for the Peter and the Wolf approach felt like it's way more interesting if Milo just shows up out of the shadows and we hear his voice first and we're not clued into that. But the idea is that something very bad is coming from his appearance and the whole end. And it was actually Kyle Clausen, who's our music editor, it was his idea to carry it through the end credits the way he did. And it was genius. I love how it worked out.
Like I said, lead right into that finale episode. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much.